All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. It's 11:03 a.m. and we've got over 40 people here. And so welcome everyone. I'm Greg Abel, and you're also seeing Latricia Harper Woods on your screen. Hi, Latricia.
Good morning. Hello.
I'm in Baltimore, Maryland, and Latricia is in Chandler, Arizona. And we know one another through an organization called PRSA Counselors Academy, which is a national network of PR agencies that are independently owned. Today's topic theme is tools for leaders to talk about race. And we are at an interesting and very, I would say, fraught time in our nation's history, both through the pandemic and through the demonstrations following the murder of George Floyd. And I think that all of us who lead organizations, who work at companies, who are just aware of what's happening in the world have felt, I would assume everyone on this webinar has felt compelled to think more deeply about the topic of race and how it intersects with both our work and our lives. And that's really the theme today, tools for leaders to talk about race and kind of to try to get over maybe the hesitancy that you might have in addressing the topic. And Latricia is here to be our guide in a certain way, as am I. I was joking with her that I will be the stand-in for the white male who's afraid to put his foot in his mouth, but we'll just go there and ask a question. So if you're feeling afraid to ask a question, I'll try to do that for you. And then also please use the Q&A or chat function at the bottom of your screen to do so. Latricia, let me throw it to you just for a professional background and tell everyone a little bit about the type of work you do.
Okay, and first I want to say there are no wrong questions in this webinar. The only wrong question is the one that you don't ask, because if you don't ask, then we can't get to the real issue. So please feel free, feel safe to ask whatever you need to ask, and there's no judgment here. I have been in public relations for 25 years. And I started in Wichita, Kansas, and worked in government. And then that was what brought me to Arizona to work in government here. And then after 15 years in government, I decided to start my own public relations firm, Mahogany Zan Communications. And I work with companies across the country on branding, crisis communications, multicultural communications, public relations, and marketing. And a lot of my clients are dealing with these issues right now of how do they show up in a time like this, and how do they talk to their clients and their team and their memberships. And so these are real conversations that we're having every day. So we thought this would be a good opportunity to kind of share the tools that I share with my clients with all of you, and help you navigate these really uncharted waters right now. So welcome and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Tricia. Personally, I've really enjoyed our conversations over the years. We've known each other probably almost 10 years through counselors, both by going to events and being on the board together. And I know that I've appreciated the opportunity just to be able to talk to you about issues involving race and work. So let's get into it a little bit. I think that following the nationwide protests when it was very, very intense, which would be maybe the first 2 weeks in June when we were seeing protests every night, there was certainly a lot of response in corporate America where people were issuing statements, were saying things publicly about a lack of tolerance for racial inequality and that Black Lives Matter. And then the next level would be to have conversations at work about race. And I want to pay off what we said we would do in this webinar. So, to start, I would ask you, what is your best advice for people who want to do the right thing, to talk about race at work and what people are concerned about, what's on their mind, and they don't even know where to start?
Well, I think the absolute first thing to do is to remove the thought that this does not involve you or your company or your team. And I think there are leaders who have thought, well, this is a political issue, so we don't really discuss politics in the office, or, this really doesn't match the makeup of my company, so it doesn't really concern me. But it actually does, because Social injustice is not a political issue, it's a human issue, and your employees are humans. So even if they're not directly impacted by what is happening in our nation, they're indirectly impacted. They watch the news, they've seen the coverage, they know someone who has been impacted. So the first thing that leaders must do is know that it does pertain to them. And then when you get through that and you decide that it's time for your team and your organization to discuss this issue, you need to have a plan. You need to know what your why is. Why is it important for you to discuss this at this time? And then once you have your why, you need to look at the history that your company has had. And if you're not a company that has a diverse team, why is that? And when we talk about diversity, I know we're mostly focused on race on this call, but diversity, it encompasses a lot of different things. So you need to look at the makeup of your team and then determine what is going to be the best approach for you to address them. So you create your plan and you start your plan with the end in mind. What do you want to accomplish? And then work back from there. And then that's a really great start to getting you ready to have the conversation.
So, Latricia, I think one of the things I've always been curious is about in this, you have good intentions and you want to have an inclusive company, and you wake up and you kind of look around, you realize that maybe you haven't done the best work in this area. Mm-hmm. Do you start with a kind of maybe a town hall with everybody at the company, kind of like, hey, let's get some feelings out on the table? I'm sure everyone is thinking about this, even if we're not talking about it. Or would you start with a smaller group at the leadership level so they can kind of level set, where do we go from here?
I think the town hall is a good step too, but I think your latter suggestion is the best place to start. You start with your leadership team, so together you can grasp where your company is as far as your diversity makeup and what you feel some of the issues are or could be in your company. And then once your leadership team has kind of mapped out your structure, then you also have their buy-in and their support to move the process forward. But you want to start with your leadership team, make sure everybody that has key input has a seat at the table, and then roll it out from there into a greater forum. That could be a town hall, or it could be mini town halls, it could be focus groups, whatever your internal culture is most comfortable with.
You've talked about an approach to this initial conversation that we've started calling the vault. And can you talk a little bit about why it's called the vault and why it's so important to think of it that way, this initial leadership discussion?
The vault is good for both leadership discussions and for greater team discussions, but it's called the vault because it provides a safe zone for everybody to feel free to express what they want to express. I think a lot of times when we have conversations on race, people hold back because they're fearful of reprisal, they're fearful of repercussions, they don't want to say something that might upset somebody else. They don't want to say the wrong thing, being a white person talking about race. So they never get to the real root of what the problem is in that culture. So the vault gets rid of all that. In the vault, you have rules. You have a set of operating procedures per se. It's like, in this room during this time, this is what everybody agrees to. We're not going to judge. We're going to speak freely. We're going to use empathy. We're going to be honest. And everybody agrees to that. And then, so that removes this barrier of, I can't really be myself. And then in the vault, we address the elephant in the room, because a lot of diversity discussions do not want to center around race, because race is such a difficult conversation to have and it makes everybody uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And so we deal with the elephant in the room right at the beginning. We go through role play exercises. We talk about microaggressions. We talk about being a minority, being in the majority, and the power struggle. And all of that helps the organization get to the layers of what is going on in a communication style within their organization. And from there, you can take that information and really start building an action plan to positive and get to the good.
Latricia, for a moment, you froze on me, but I could hear you the entire time. Can you hear
Okay.
and see me okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Sorry about that. Do
No,
I need
I
to
don't
repeat
know if
anything?
I've had good luck most of the time during the pandemic, and occasionally it zaps on me and I don't know whose it is. So for our participants, if you could chat us if you're having any technical issues, please do.
Yes.
But thank you. I
Or
heard
if
what
you
you
repeat anything, just put it in the chat and we'll readdress it.
Yeah, I mean, I think to address some of the points you just made, thinking a little bit about we're not going to judge. You can speak freely. This is a place where you can be honest. I get that in theory. In practice, I do think people who might have sort of some thoughts about race that aren't so comfortable to say out loud that they might keep inside. How do you coach people to look, we're not going to get anywhere unless you get it out? But I think that's a scary place. And I think I'm referring to folks who, let me be specific. It would be like someone who says, I don't understand why this even matters at work. We are here to design, maybe you're an architecture firm. We're here to design buildings and I don't get it. Like, why are we in a room talking about race? And so I would ask you, how would you respond to someone who feels that way?
Well, it really depends on the makeup of their organization, how I would specifically speak to that. But I would bring to them different things to think about. When you're in team meetings, where do your team members of color sit? Do they sit close to leadership or do they sit close to the door? Are they looking for the escape route as soon as the meeting is over? Do they freely express their opinions or thoughts on a project, or do you have to call on them? Because those things kind of signify how comfortable they are being a part of the team and being a vocal part of the team. Do they really feel valued? Do they feel like you only come to them on certain projects or ask them to take the lead during certain times and not during other times? After something happens, like the unrest that we saw following the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, are they quiet? Are they kind of reserved? Mm-hmm. Are they not as communicative as they used to be? Because they're really going through a lot. And so when people say that really doesn't affect my business, it really does, because that's human capital. And when your human capital is impacted by something like racial and social injustice, it does impact their work output. It does impact how they show up at work. And so that's why leaders who are empathetic and leaders who want to impact change, they know to look at their staff. They know to talk to them during pivotal times to say, how are you doing? I think a lot of people saw on their social media streams right after this happened, people were like, check on your Black friends, check on your Black employees. We're not doing okay. And a lot of people were like, what do you mean you're not doing okay? Well, what made this time particularly different than social unrest that we have seen over the years is the 24-hour news cycle of the continuous playing of the video with George Floyd was like watching somebody die over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. And that in a time of COVID where you couldn't really go out and shake it or get away from it, it really became a lot for people to have to handle on a daily basis. So it just seemed compounded on top of COVID. And so a lot of people were like, you really do need to check on your Black friends, your Black employees, your Black co-workers, family members, and check on them because they're not doing well. And that really kind of turned up the empathetic needle for people. Mm-hmm. But as leaders, we need to always have that ear of empathy and look at all of our employees and check on them regularly to see how they are doing during these times that we're in. These are very unusual times, and people are processing it so differently that as leaders, we have to be the ones to make sure everybody's doing okay.
Right. I mean, we're talking about the, double impact of the pandemic followed by the what you just described. And I want to ask you a really small point, but maybe it's a big one, and then get back to the how of this. And I hope this doesn't sound silly. This is another one of those, sometimes I'm afraid to ask, but I want to ask on behalf of people who might be afraid.
You can ask anything.
Do you say Black or African American when you're talking to about a person of color in your work environment? Is it okay to say we should check on you've been saying Black employees, so I would think that's giving tacit permission for others to do so. But you hear people saying African American, and I wonder, is that the more appropriate way to describe someone of that cultural background? So what would you say is the answer?
My first thing to say is you always ask them, because that they are the expert on their ethnic background, their ethnicity, and so you want to ask, what would you prefer to be called? When you're speaking of a general sense, Black is kind of the umbrella, because when you say African American, you are lumping a bunch of people in a title that may not really be in that title. Because there's Jamaican Americans and Haitian Americans and Dominican Americans and Cuban Americans, which all could be pictured in the Black category, but they're not African American. So I always start by saying, if you have a question, ask that person directly. I prefer Black or African American. I'm okay with both, but ask. And if not, what I've counseled clients on is saying Black, which AP Style has now deemed that when you're speaking of Black in reference to a race or ethnic community of people, that is capital B, and Indigenous people is capital I. And so Black as the umbrella, unless you've asked and they said another specific category. Okay.
Yeah, thank you for that guidance. I think it's just one of those things that I can feel myself hesitate sometimes, and it's good to kind of understand maybe the appropriate parameters to think about that. Getting back to that conversation, you brought up a lot of really good points, and we were talking specifically about the situation where you do need to check on your Black employees and kind of say, how are you feeling in this moment? And I guess, again, what's the appropriate way to do that? Is it really just, how are you feeling? I know this is a difficult time, and just letting them talk, or do you coach folks to use more, bring professional moderators and support involved in these environments? Because I do think what you're describing is trauma. Certainly many people have experienced trauma as a result of COVID-19 and this pandemic, and then maybe also from the after the deaths and the protests and everything else happening in our country, and seeing that on a loop has been just devastating. And so I guess the question is there a right and wrong way to check on people?
Yes, that's a very good question. How candid can I be at 11 a.m. Eastern time?
No, I asked you if it's okay to say Black. Just go ahead.
Okay. There is a right or wrong way. The most important thing is that you check on people. The second most important thing is that you give them a little heads up on what you're going to do. I say that because I was on a conference call that I thought was to talk about diversity strategies, and we all jump on the call and they say, we want to hear from our Black team members. How are you feeling?
Without warning, you're saying?
Yes. And so I wasn't really prepared to have that discussion at that particular time, because my mindset was on something else. And then they broke down in tears. So now not only can I not express myself, because now I have to make sure you're okay, because now you're emotional. So I have to go into fix it mode before we can even get to your question of how am I feeling. So you need to because it is an emotional time, give your people a little bit of a heads up. Say, I want to talk to you if that's okay, to
Mhm.
see how you're doing. If you're going to do a one-on-one, if you're going to do more of a group session, and you're not comfortable leading those types of sessions, get somebody who is. Maybe it's your HR person, maybe it's your second in command, maybe it's an outside third party that has expertise and objectivity because you're so close to your employees, and then have them lead that discussion. And maybe you do kind of a group setting or a mini town hall where you can talk about what's happening in the country overall, COVID and social injustice and racial injustice, and how are we feeling about it as a group? How are we feeling about it as a team? And then approach it that way. There's a number of different ways to have that conversation, but you have to start by giving the person time to kind of emotionally and mentally prepare to have it, and not just spring into their office or call them on the phone and say, hey, I just want to see, how are you doing about racial injustice today?
Right. You can't just
I'm
pop
gonna,
that.
yeah, I'm gonna be like, wait a minute, where are we going right now?
Yeah, I think that it's a really interesting and important point that you can have all the right intentions, but if you kind of handle it clumsily, it can have the opposite effect. I think that's why some of these things have not been talked about for so long. I'm going to share my screen for a sec, and we'll look at some tips that you helped put together. Um, and we can talk through those a little bit and then start taking some questions as well. So let me share this, and our attendees, so what I'll do is also send this around via email. So this is a pretty straightforward document. Latricia, you can see this now, right?
Yep, and we've already talked about a couple of them.
Yeah.
Planning, understanding your why. And be honest, if your why is just like, I feel like we haven't done enough on this subject and we need to do more, that's a great why, because that's your truth. So know your why and start with your end result in mind. And you have to acknowledge your organization's history on race and social justice. Even if there hasn't been any, that's okay. But you have to know what you've done in the past so you can move forward. There may be things, if you're a larger organization, that you have to fix or atone for before you can move forward. So you have to reflect. And then setting the stage is kind of what we talked about in the vault. You have to have a sense of empathy and a safe space for people really to be open and to share, because it is a very difficult conversation, and they will hold back if they feel like something that they said could be used against them later.
Mm-hmm.
I think the fourth one, bring your listening ear, is very, very important. I think as leaders, we are quick to want to defend our organization or defend our team or defend our actions, which closes us off from the listening process. So you really kind of have to dial that back so you can listen and hear and truly understand what's being said, instead of kind of putting up barriers by saying, well, this is why we've done this, or this is why we haven't done that, because that really stops the process cold.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about getting help. If you don't feel like you're skilled or comfortable in this setting, to bring a facilitator on board to help you lead this conversation. But the what's next is the most important thing. It's one thing to have the conversation, but after you have the conversation, that can't just be it. You can't just say, okay, well, we had the race talk, we're good, everybody had a chance to say what they needed to say, let's move on. You have to have an action plan that takes the information that you've gleaned from the conversation and moves your organization forward. And it also has to have an aspect where you can continue to have the conversation, maybe not on a large scale, but where employees feel like they have a chance to speak to you or speak to someone about their concerns, their feelings, how they fit in the organizational structure, how they find value on your team.
Latricia, we've got one question that's come in around how to handle the conversation when you have a small team, less than 10, and there is not obvious diversity. Maybe there's diversity in age or thought or where you grew up, but people look the same in the room. Maybe everybody's white. What? But you also have the impulse. I'm going to stop the share. I'll share this document with everyone who's here. You have the impulse to do the right thing. So you want to address hiring initiatives. You want to address how we think about things, but you're also sitting there looking at each other going like, how do we even begin when we're all kind of the same?
Well, I think small teams have a good advantage because they're nimble, they can be super flexible, and they can be open and honest because they feel more like a family, more like, more connected. But I think you start with the question, why are we not more diverse? What are we missing as far as our recruiting efforts? Do we match the makeup of our target audiences? Probably not. How do we fix that? Do we match the makeup of our supply chain, our vendors, our subcontractors? Probably not. So what do we need to do to be more inclusive and more representative of the audiences that we serve? It's really important now more than ever because millennials, as well as communities of color, are starting to really take a look at the companies that they support and how they're made up, to make sure that they are representative of the communities that you serve. So if you have customers or clients that are from communities of color and you don't have a team that matches that, my question to you is, how are you authentically meeting those needs?
Right.
You don't have anybody at the table from those communities. But you have to be really, really careful that your efforts do not go from being inclusive to being tokenism.
I think that's so tricky because I struggle with it, and I want to ask you a specific instance. And so, I put together webinars and panels, and we have to check even at the counselors level, which is a national organization. We're like, all right, we're going to have a panel, and then we have to visualize that panel. Like, oh, you know what? I just realized we just booked 3 white men. We better make sure we have a female and a person of color. But is that the right thing to do? It feels like the right thing to do, but you're saying don't tokenize. So how do you weigh the two things?
You have to look at the makeup of the organization. Take Counselors Academy, for example, and I don't know our exact demographic makeups. If the majority of Counselors Academy is female, why would you have a panel that's majority male?
I don't have a good answer.
Now, I do know as far as ethnic representation on counselors, it is low.
Sure.
So in that instance, where your panelists may not make up your exact representation of your organization, when you continue to say we want to be more diverse, we want to attract a more diverse audience, then you have to put that out there to get that back. Because for me, as a Black female who's a member of Counselors Academy, if all the presenters are white, in my head, I'm hearing either we could not, for some reason, find African American or Black presenters to meet these needs, or we did not put the effort in. Because I know they're there. I just don't know why they're not on the stage that I'm seeing.
Right. I think this speaks to intent. In other words, like
Absolutely.
if you have a company that does not have any minority employees, and I'll be very vulnerable, we currently do not. So Able Communications has 11 employees, none of whom are people of color. We have, particularly in recent months, and I've known this to be an issue for a long time, been more proactive in doing something about it. And it's really uncomfortable to talk about because I'm like, here I am trying to do the right thing. I hope I'm helping others right now. by giving a forum for this discussion. And then I realized we haven't done that well at home. And
But
then,
I beg to differ. You are doing some new things
yeah.
to help your team, and I think you should talk about those. Like,
Well, thanks. I certainly don't need to make this an infomercial for us, but I do want to walk the talk. And so we have a couple of initiatives. You know, we are being more thoughtful about partnerships, for example. So this is an example of a partnership. So even though we don't have full-time staff right now who are Black, I have a partnership with you, and we're talking about doing workshops together for our clients and partners and things like this. We are partnering with Morgan State in Baltimore to create an internship program. And we recently rolled out a program called Boost Be More to help small businesses. And particularly, we're hoping to work with Morgan students to help give them some experience and help boost small business in our city who are struggling based on the pandemic. And so I think what that speaks to, even as I say it out loud, I don't want to pat myself on the back, but I recognize, and this has been even more so pushed by my staff and my team than me, which is another good learning, is like you have to ask what people want to do and how they might get involved, because that's empowering also. And then you don't have to shoulder the load. You can say to your employees, hey, what do you think? How might we address this? And, you know, it's about creating a plan, and then probably more importantly, follow through, you know.
absolutely. And
Now we have to bring these students in and make sure they have a good experience and not just check a box.
And I think what you said is very, very important, because you have to be intentional. And I get a lot of questions from PR colleagues across the country. We just cannot diversify our team. We're just in a very white community. It's just not going to happen. We can't diversify our team. We don't know where to start. And it's the last thing that they say that's the most important. They just don't know where to start. Mm-hmm. So there's kind of like three different tracks you can go. You can grow your own through your program with Morgan State. You're bringing in interns that could become staff when they graduate. And so you're kind of growing your own PR team. So that's always a good way, because then you're bringing them in on the ground floor and they're growing up with your company. You can partner with other organizations or partner with other firms that meet that demographic that you don't have. So that's like the partnership that we have. Or you can see a really great person working for another company and you can try to steal them away. But other company probably won't like you, and don't tell them you heard it here. But that does happen all the time.
Wow. Yeah, that's just
you know, I call that pilfering. But you know, you can do that. But there's a lot of organizations that you can work with in your communities that people don't think about working with. Are you a member of the Black Chamber? Is your company a member of the Hispanic Chamber or the Asian American Chamber? Those are really great organizations to be a part of, where you can kind of get on the ground floor and learn more about them and the companies that are members, and really build some relationships. Working with the NAACP, working with the National Urban League, every city has a chapter. Working with universities in your area, like what you're doing with Morgan State. There's a lot of different avenues. If you're in a larger city, working with members of the Divine Nine fraternities and sororities. There's 5 fraternities and 4 sororities that are historically Black. And we have alumni chapters across the globe. So that's another avenue as well. So there's a lot of different ways for you to find talent. You just have to be intentional in wanting to make those connections.
That's great advice, Latricia. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And I want to thank you for the coaching you've given me over the years, and acknowledge, I want to get into some of the Q&A because there's a bunch coming in, and we'll start addressing those. But I think that, one of the things that might be important to address is the fact that even if you're late to the party, don't be afraid to join the movement. I know I'm mixing metaphors there, but like, when we were getting ready for this, you had mentioned you did a webinar yesterday, and one of the questions was, if I've done nothing up to this point, is it too late? And how would you answer that question?
Unfortunately, it's not too late because this is not the end of what we're going through. It's not like on today's June 30th and July 1, we're gonna wake up and be in a completely different space. We're not. So you're not late to the party. I think the worst thing you can do is to do nothing. So even if you're just now thinking about it, that's absolutely fine. I would say, however, if you're thinking about issuing a company statement, and something that I've counseled my clients on, make sure that company statement is, one, in line with your company values, and two, vetted by your team.
Mm-hmm.
We have seen companies put out statements, and within minutes, their employees hit social media and going, "That's really nice to read, but that's not what I'm living."
Right.
Every day.
With brands, right? They think they're taking this important high road, which the substance of the words is good, but you're saying the character and the culture and the organization doesn't match the statement.
Absolutely. And because your team, they are your best form of advertisement and your worst critics.
Yeah.
So if you're not walking your talk, they're going to call you out on that. So make sure your company statement is in line with your company values. And if it's not, be open to the idea of revamping your company values at this time. Maybe,
That's
and it's a living, breathing document. It was never meant to sit on a shelf for perpetuity.
What if you framed it and put it on the wall in the lobby that no one goes to anymore?
Put a new frame. Support a small business and get that reframed.
I really like that point you made, because you have to live your values, and you have to, I think one of the things, we've been doing a series of webinars on crisis communication since the pandemic started. And one of the themes that has emerged is start inside first. Yes. So when you're thinking about a communications plan, don't start telling the world what you're up to before you tell your people. And right, because just like the point you're making, if you start kind of making these big, bold statements and you haven't cleared that internally, you're going to look not so good. And you'll also get smarter in the process of listening, that really active listening skill internally. So, go ahead, Tricia, I'm going to start reading through some of these questions we're getting. Go ahead.
But and the second part of that is, it also gives you street cred, because if you're counseling clients on something that you have not done yourself, the first question they're going to ask you is, so, did you do this for your firm, and how'd that go? And what are you going to say? But
well, yeah.
But if you've done the work internally, then that helps you in the counsel that you give to your clients.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I also think one of the things that I think can empower leaders to a certain extent is the knowledge that having discussions of diversity is quote unquote good for business. In other words, you don't know what opportunities you're not getting because you're not diverse. And you might not know how people might stay away because they've already done their research and you never got the call in the first place.
Because they took a look at your website, and your website did not have a "we're welcome and open to business of color" sign on it.
Correct. And that speaks to mission and vision and intent. And, this is not easy work, but I think awareness is the first step.
Absolutely.
Conversations and action plans. And so, all right, so let's get into some questions, and everyone please feel free to keep popping in on the chat. And I had some brand case studies, but I think I'll hold off on the brand case studies for now and get into questions, and we'll see if we have time at the end. What do you suggest in work environments that are minority owned and culturally diverse in leadership, middle management, and lower tiers, but there are no conversations about this moment that have happened? Complete silence. Is that even healthy? I am bothered by the awkwardness.
It's not helping. Again, I think when a lot of people were posting, check on your Black friends, check on your Black teammates, there was another statement that went out that says, we can see who is silent, and that silence is deafening. As leaders, when you choose to take what you feel is the high road and not discuss it, your employees see you. and they see your actions, and what that relates to them as, what I'm going through is not important, which means I'm not important. And that's not what you want your team members to feel. So you feel like you're taking a different road, but it's translating into something else. So when your leadership is silent, when they don't want to have the discussion, it does leave your team feeling like they're in a void. They're in a hole where they don't matter. Their work doesn't matter. And so then they start looking to go elsewhere where they can really find value.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. Thank you. All right, Latricia, how about recommendations for training and or certifications to have an internal person at a company with this expertise? And I believe by this expertise, we're talking about either D&I discussions or specifically in relation to, having conversations with employees of color. So the question is training and or certifications to have an internal person. Do you have any thoughts on that?
There's a lot of different training programs out there and certifications, just depending on where you're located. And Greg will provide my information. And if you want to follow up with me, I can kind of help you find some. For teams that are not large enough to have a person on board that's completely committed to this, there are experts in every community that focus on DEI, that focuses on race conversations and race relations, that can come in and talk to your company, kind of understand your company makeup, and then help you build a strong DEI or DNI, whichever you prefer, program that's specifically designed for your company and the makeup of your team.
Mm-hmm. So, right, you can either build this internally or you can go hire appropriate consultants and then work on a plan. I think, again, the most important thing is recognizing that there's a need for the work and then finding the right resource to address the challenges. And I think that obviously has to start with leadership saying, yeah, this is a thing we need to address.
Mm-hmm. I think companies always want to say it's in HR, and that may not be a good fit for it. It really, if you're going to bring a person on that this is their role, they really have to answer directly to the leadership, directly to your president or CEO. It has to have a direct pipeline.
That's an important point. It can't get right. Not someone just kind of like, that might be tokenizing if they weren't, right? Because you're just saying, yeah, we've got a D&I person, we've done our job, but they're buried
like 5 levels below. Yeah.
Right. Does that person have any real authority to make change happen or make recommendations for change?
Because that person needs to be able to talk about internal issues as well as external. How are you showing up to your clients? How are you showing up with your supply chain? How is it impacting your business model? So it's not just an HR function. It is an overall operations function.
Right. And interestingly, look, we're two owners of public relations firms who are having a conversation about diversity, inclusion, and protest movements and how employees are feeling. And I think it's important to just call out the fact that operational challenges become PR challenges, or operational excellence becomes PR excellence when you do the right or address problems. And as we all know, it's a lot easier to never have a problem than to try to fix it when it occurs. Mm-hmm. And so it's been interesting to me to see how brands have gotten involved in this discussion and the impact that it's had on their business. And there's kind of two sides of the coin. One is, any CEO, business owner, leader wants to run a profitable operation. It's the whole point to a certain extent. And then there's the impulse to do the right thing. And those things don't have to be mutually exclusive is something I'm awakening to in a way.
Right. But
social cause can be good for business is I guess what I'm saying.
A more inclusive business is a more successful business all around. It just opens you up to more opportunities.
Okay, another question, and please feel free to keep sending these in. We've got another 10 minutes or so in the webinar. What are some ways that white or non-Black individuals can be active allies to their Black colleagues, friends, and family? Sometimes I'm hesitant to ask because I don't want to place a further burden on those people, those individuals to tell me what they need, but I want to do the right work.
That is a very, very important question, and thank you so much for asking that. I think asking the question is never a wrong thing. Asking someone to do your homework for you is. And I say that to say, a lot of people contacted me and my friends and colleagues and said, we want to help. What can we do?
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing we really honestly wanted to tell you was Google. Because it's like,
do your own homework, so to speak.
Right, because when you come to me with that question, I hear, give me a checklist of 4 to 5 things that I can do, that I can go and check off and say that I've done something.
Mm-hmm.
So now the onus is on me to come up with a list for you to help me.
I had a conversation with a friend I took part in a leadership program last year in Baltimore. It's called The Leadership, a program of the Greater Baltimore Committee. And I was having conversations kind of like this to check in with my Black friends from leadership. And one of my friends said to me, the racial equality movement is not a self-help exercise for white people.
It is not.
And I was sort of like, ouchie, I had to absorb the blow because I was like, I didn't want to be that person in that moment. But I think your advice is good. And I'm reminded of something my wife often does, which is if, there's someone experiences a death in the family or is having a hard time, instead of calling and saying, what can I do? She'll make a lasagna and drop it off. You know what I mean?
Yes.
It's that equivalent, isn't it?
Yes, it's that equivalent. I mean, there's a reason why the book White Fragility is so popular, because it's called White Fragility. So we have to kind of tiptoe around some things. But I think just calling your friend and saying, I've had friends call and just say, you know what, I'm not going to ask you what can I do, because I can look up all that information on my own. I can see how to get active locally and nationally and what to do. But what do you need and how are you? And just giving me that space to say what I want or not say what I want is helpful. Because
that's the difference between, go ahead, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to just kind of draw a distinction there, because you're saying that is a person caring about you as a human and saying, right, Latricia, how are you doing? Which feels good for someone to care about you. But then when someone says, Latricia, I'd like to do something good in the community as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement, what should I do? I think that one can be tiresome for you and people who are already a part of this. And there's so many resources you could just find, rather than burdening you with helping me with my self-improvement project. I think that's the difference.
Yes, because if you Google how to help the Black community, I promise you are not going to have a lack of information. It's everywhere. But I think I just want people to understand this. It's a moment. It's a movement, but what happens long-term is what's going to make the difference, because everybody is aware right now. And when you're aware, you change. So we're hoping that with the awareness that everybody has and is feeling, and they're wanting to help and they want to be allies, if this continues, that is where real change happens. Mm-hmm. So it goes back to this question that you asked before, is it too late to stand up and take a stand? It's not, because that's what keeps the momentum going. It's not everybody showing up in June, throwing up a statement and saying, okay, Black Power, Black Lives Matter, happy Juneteenth, and let's make it a national holiday. And then we move to July and it's something else.
Right. I
It,
mean, I already feel like the intensity of the demonstrations has died down and the intensity of the moment has come down a little bit, even though we're still talking about this and we need to keep it. It's like this is where the work has to continue. And there have been some funny, ironic memes I've seen where, like, white people are tired of the civil rights movement 3 days in, like
right.
I'm on board. I'm exhausted, and it's been a week.
Probably
You know,
401 years and okay, in counting, but okay. It's like,
So to that point, Latricia, how do you? Another question that came through the chat is, how do we address those who think that there isn't a problem, who have said like, didn't Lincoln free the slaves, 150 years ago? Why is this still something where, the civil rights movement happened in the 60s, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Why is this still a thing? And again, I'm just being the vulnerable white man here. I don't believe those things. I'm just asking the question.
unfortunately, there's going to be some people that will never see the need for these conversations and never see the value in this moment right now. And to that, I would say the less time we spend giving energy to that is the more energy we can give to people who really want to be allies, who really want to be progressive, who really want to do the right thing for the community at large and put that energy there. We have 51 people on this webinar. And so I think we have 51 people who are looking to be better leaders, stronger allies, better community servants, and they're looking for ways to do that. So I prefer to give my energy to these 51 individuals instead of the person who's like, well, aren't you glad that you don't live on a plantation anymore? And, crazy stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there's a lot of folks who would just rather not deal with it, and that's unfortunate. I've had personal conversations with leaders of companies that we do business with who have said, no one has said anything to me, so I don't really want to go there. And I think that's unfortunate. Yeah.
And to that person, I would say, have you made it a comfortable situation for people to say something to you? Because if I know that if I talk to you, I'm talking to someone who strongly does not care, I'm not going to waste my time.
Mm-hmm.
So to that person, I would think his employees probably feel the same, his or her employees probably feel the same way, that this is not even something I'm going to bring up because it's going to fall on deaf ears. And that's unfortunate.
There's a question in the chat that probably deserves a longer answer than we have time for, Latricia, but I'm going to try to, let's give it a shot. Wondering about the role of an educational workshop to get people on the same page regarding the fact that racism exists and how it acts at a systemic and organizational level, and not just interpersonal. From your experience, how does it work when this is done first and then into these steps you outlined versus at another time? I think this is a question about timing and figuring out where to start and the effectiveness of a workshop versus the continuing work and that type of thing.
I think that would probably be a good idea. I do think a lot of people do not understand the systemic racism that has gone on for a long time and how that has played out in different scenarios. I think it was really interesting when the Surgeon General came out and said, COVID is going to affect Black and brown people more than everybody else because of our social lifestyle choices, because we smoke too much, we drink too much, we party too much, whatever. Where medical professionals came out and said, no, it's probably because of lack of access to healthcare that has gone on for decades, lack of education about how to live healthier lifestyles, lack of access to nutritional food options because most communities are in food deserts.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like those things are going to impact and the fact that Black and brown people are frontline workers, they're essential workers, and they have to go to work every day.
Mm-hmm.
So those things are probably going to be why they catch COVID-19 more than whether they have a drink every day.
Right.
And so,
And I think what we're talking about are historical structural racism
right.
versus.
And barriers to advancement that communities of color have experienced over time. So I do think helping organizations understand that helps them see how we got to where we are today.
Right, a much wider lens is in
Yes,
need, right? Because if you start
absolutely.
wide, you can get narrow, but if you start narrow, it's harder to get wide.
Right. And
That's
so
kind
for that person that's thinking we don't have a problem with racism, that may be helpful to kind of open their eyes to
yeah.
the systemic racism that has existed for quite some time.
Well, I mentioned the leadership program I was in last year. We did a full day on Baltimore's racist history and the redlining that took place
Yeah.
earlier in the 20th century that created a lot of the systemic problems that we live with and are challenged with today. And if you don't know that, then it becomes more convenient to just say these communities don't know how to, I don't know, take care of themselves when they've
Right.
been dealt a tough hand from the start.
Pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and
Yeah,
it's kind of
all
hard
that.
when you don't have boots or straps.
Well, we're coming up on noon. I want to get a couple things in, and we'll end in the next minute or two if people can hang around for a minute. One important note I wanted to share was like we are going to give away 1 hour workshop with Latricia to anyone who participated in the panel and lasted this long. We're just going to do a random draw, and you can gain the benefit of her wisdom. I might sit in as well just to keep learning from my partner, and then we will have future webinars as well that will communicate with you over email. The next one we're teeing up that isn't finalized yet is going to be a panel of Black journalists talking about covering the moment we're in today. And so
I want to
that's
be a part of that one. Sign me up for that one.
you will be invited. And then the last question, I like this one.
I am a member of AZABJ, so yes.
Oh, good. All right, thanks. Actually, two things. One is people have been asking about brands and the best responses. I think for my money and for a lot of people who have been following this, Ben & Jerry's is an example to follow. So I just popped this on the screen. If you want to just Google Ben & Jerry's statement and you'll see something very, they don't beat around the bush. They're not saying, maybe we should take part or, it's very overt. And there's a statement followed by a very specific action plan. So this has been an activist brand forever.
Yes, and if somebody is really looking for action steps that they want to take, Ben & Jerry's has laid out a good set of 4 or 5 things that anyone can do to promote social justice.
All right, I don't want to get in trouble, but I will ask you to try to answer in 30 seconds. Latricia, how do you deal with people who say, I don't see color, I just hire the best person?
In 30 seconds, if you don't see color, then you don't see me on this screen, because the very first thing we notice about people as humans is how they look. And so when you tell me that you don't see my color, what you tell me is you don't see the experience and the expertise and the history and traditions that I bring to the table, because I stand on the shoulders of generations of African Americans and Black people who have done tremendous things for the country. And that's something that I'm very proud of. So when you say you don't see color, you don't see me and what I bring to the table.
You gave me the chills with that one, Latricia. I think that it's an appropriate place to wrap up. So this has been recorded, and if anyone wants to share with folks in their network, you'll receive an email as well as an email with the tips we put on the screen and some other resources.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Thank you so much.
For your time and your wisdom. We'll talk soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.